Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm excited to share with you a truly powerful and deeply heartwarming story. The ornate crystal chandelier hanging above the polished mahogany conference table cast intricate, dancing shadows across the faces of four men who had been close friends ever since their college days. Julian Westwood listlessly swirled the amber liquid in his glass, barely registering the details as his friends animatedly debated the relative merits of their latest high-stakes business acquisitions. The conversation had become predictably tiresome, as it often did during these Friday evening gatherings at his luxurious downtown penthouse. "I'm telling you, the property market in the coastal region is about to absolutely explode," Benjamin Carter insisted, leaning forward with the characteristic intensity of a man who genuinely believed that his opinions carried significantly more weight than those of most other people. Anyone with even an ounce of common sense should be investing heavily there right now. Julian absently glanced toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the glittering city skyline. Somewhere far below, some 20 floors down, countless ordinary people were just finishing their long workdays, eagerly heading home to their families and their lives that didn't solely revolve around complex stock portfolios and intricate investment strategies. He couldn't help but wonder precisely when his own life had become so predictably structured and, frankly, so profoundly empty, despite all the vast wealth he had managed to accumulate over the years. "You're not even paying attention to a word I'm saying," Thomas Brennan accused, pointedly snapping his fingers directly in front of Julian's face. "What's gotten into you lately, buddy? You've been totally distracted and out of it for weeks now." Before Julian could even formulate a coherent response, the door to his private study opened quietly and unobtrusively. Emma Rodriguez entered the room with a gleaming silver tray carefully balancing fresh glasses and a brand-new bottle of expensive whiskey. She moved with a practiced and efficient grace that clearly demonstrated her 3 years of experience working within the Westwood household. Her long dark hair was neatly pulled back into a severe bun, and her simple uniform did absolutely nothing to detract from the quiet and inherent dignity with which she carried herself. "Thank you, Emma," Julian said, his tone polite and carefully neutral, but also somewhat distant, as it always was when addressing the household staff. She nodded silently and began to turn to leave the room, but not before Benjamin's voice abruptly stopped her in her tracks. "Wait just a moment there," he said, a mischievous glint twinkling in his eye. "Julian, isn't this the maid you were just telling us about? The one who took it upon herself to completely rearrange your entire library without even bothering to ask for your permission first?" Julian felt an unwelcome flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He had vaguely mentioned the incident to his friends in passing, mostly complaining about how Emma had brazenly taken it upon herself to completely reorganize his extensive book collection by subject and author, rather than adhering to the somewhat random and chaotic system he had been using for years. What he conspicuously hadn't told them was that her meticulously organized system was actually far superior to his own haphazard one, and that he had been secretly quite impressed by her extensive knowledge of literature. "That would be me, sir," Emma replied calmly, directly meeting Benjamin's gaze without even the slightest hint of flinching. "I sincerely apologize if the new arrangement doesn't suit your particular preferences. I can certainly restore the original order if you wish." "Oh no," Julian said quickly, far too quickly. "The new system is perfectly fine. Actually, it's better than fine. It's a vast improvement, really." The third friend, Daniel Morrison, leaned back comfortably in his chair with a distinctly amused expression on his face. "She certainly seems remarkably confident for someone who is considered just household help. Tell me, do you always take such liberties with your employer's valuable possessions?" Emma's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but her voice remained perfectly steady and even. "I take a great deal of pride in my work, sir. Mr. Westwood has an exceptionally impressive collection of books, and it genuinely deserves to be properly organized so that the books can be easily found and, more importantly, truly appreciated." "Appreciated," Benjamin repeated with a loud and somewhat derisive laugh. "Listen to the way she talks. You'd almost think that she actually reads those dusty old books instead of simply cleaning around them." "I do read them, actually," Emma said, her composure never wavering in the slightest despite the overt condescension dripping from his tone. "Mr. Westwood possesses several quite remarkable first editions of classic novels. The annotations in his particular copy of Pride and Prejudice strongly suggest that it once belonged to a highly respected literary scholar. Julian felt something subtly shift deep inside him. He realized with a start that he had never actually noticed those intriguing annotations, and, truth be told, he had never even bothered to open that particular book. Yet his maid, someone he barely even acknowledged beyond the most basic and perfunctory pleasantries, had not only read it but also fully understood its historical significance. Thomas laughed loudly. Well, isn't she just full of unexpected surprises? Julian, where on earth did you find this one? She's certainly not your typical cleaning lady, that's for sure. I found the position through a reputable employment agency 3 years ago, Emma answered smoothly before Julian could even begin to formulate a response. Now, if you gentlemen will all excuse me, I have other important duties to attend to. She swiftly left the room with her head held high and her shoulders squared, and for a brief moment, a palpable silence descended over the small group. Then, Benjamin burst out laughing uproariously. Did you see the way she looked at us? Like we were somehow beneath her, not the other way around. Someone really should teach that girl her proper place in society. I thought she was perfectly respectful, Julian found himself saying, surprising himself with the uncharacteristic defensiveness in his voice. Oh, come on, Julian, Daniel chimed in, rolling his eyes. She was clearly putting on airs, acting as if she's somehow our equal. It's almost amusing, really. She probably goes home to her tiny apartment and tells her friends she had a fascinating conversation with the great Julian Westwood and his highly successful associates. I seriously doubt she's that impressed by us, Julian muttered under his breath. This somewhat cynical comment sparked an intriguing idea in Benjamin's ever-scheming mind, and his eyes lit up with mischievous glee. Actually, this gives me a truly brilliant idea. Julian, you do remember that your annual charity gala is coming up in just 2 weeks, right? That incredibly exclusive event where everyone who's anyone in the city shows up dressed to the nines? What about it? Julian asked wearily, already sensing where this was inevitably heading. I'll bet you $50,000 that you don't have the courage to actually invite your maid to attend the gala as your personal guest, Benjamin declared dramatically, slapping the highly polished table for emphasis. The other 2 men immediately perked up with obvious interest, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Thomas grinned widely. Now, this could be supremely entertaining. Can you even begin to imagine her showing up in some cheap department store dress, completely out of her depth and utterly lost among the city's elite? That's incredibly cruel, Julian protested weakly, though without much conviction. Is it really, though? Daniel argued, his eyebrows raised. You'd actually be giving her an amazing opportunity that most people in her position could only ever dream of having. A rare chance to see how the other half lives. Besides, she seems remarkably confident and surprisingly well-read. Let's see if she can actually handle herself in that rarefied environment. Benjamin leaned forward conspiratorially, clearly sensing victory was within his grasp. Come on, Julian. When have you ever backed down from a challenge, no matter how ridiculous? 50,000 says you won't even invite her, and another 50,000 says that even if you do, she won't accept. And if, by some unbelievable miracle, she actually accepts and shows up, I'll add another 100,000 that she'll be completely out of place and utterly miserable within the first hour. Julian felt torn between his better judgment and his deeply ingrained sense of pride. These elaborate betting games had been an integral part of their long-standing friendship for many years, though they had never previously involved another person quite so directly or so personally. Yet, something about this particular challenge undeniably intrigued him. Emma had displayed more genuine intelligence and quiet composure in just 5 minutes than most of the shallow people who would be attending his lavish gala typically displayed in an entire evening. Fine, he heard himself saying, much to his own surprise. 200,000 total. I'll invite her. She'll accept, and she'll hold her own far better than at least half the guests who will be there. The men shook hands solemnly, sealing the somewhat ludicrous wager, and immediately began discussing the precise terms and conditions in considerably more detail. But as the long evening slowly wore on and his friends eventually departed, Julian sat alone in his study, idly swirling the remaining whiskey in his glass and wondering what he had just impulsively agreed to. The bet had certainly seemed simple enough in the heat of the moment, fueled by alcohol and the need to prove himself. But now, in the relative quiet of his luxurious home, he began to seriously question his underlying motivations. Was he really doing this solely to prove his boisterous friends wrong? Or was there something else entirely that was driving him to take such an uncharacteristic risk? The unvarnished truth was that Emma had intrigued him from the very first day she had started working in his home. Unlike the previous staff members, who had been either overly deferential and obsequious or quietly resentful and passive-aggressive, she genuinely treated her often thankless work with a deep sense of sincere care and consistently showed a subtle interest in his personal belongings that clearly went far beyond mere perfunctory duty. He had definitely noticed other things over the past 3 years, too, even though he had never explicitly allowed himself to consciously dwell on them for too long. Things like the way she sometimes hummed softly while working, humming old, almost forgotten melodies that spoke of a rich musical background, and the remarkably careful and almost reverent way she always handled his late grandmother's antique vases, as if she genuinely understood their inherent value far beyond their purely monetary price. And the meticulous notes she invariably left behind whenever something in the house needed repair, always written in an elegant and almost old-fashioned handwriting that clearly suggested an education far beyond what her current humble position might logically indicate. Julian poured himself another generous drink and stared thoughtfully out at the glittering city lights spread out before him. Tomorrow he would formally extend the invitation, and then he would finally see what Emma Rodriguez was really made of. He told himself it was all just about winning the ridiculous bet. But deep down, a small but persistent part of him secretly hoped that she would truly surprise them all. The very next morning, Julian found Emma in the vast library, carefully and meticulously dusting the towering shelves with the same unwavering attention to detail that she brought to absolutely everything she did within the household. Bright sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, illuminating the thousands of carefully arranged books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She didn't immediately notice him standing there, and he took a moment to simply observe her quietly. She was gently running her fingers along the spine of a particularly old and worn leather-bound volume, her lips moving ever so slightly as if silently savoring the book's title. "Emma," he said, clearing his throat gently, "do you have a moment to spare?" She turned around quickly, visibly startled, and immediately set down her cleaning supplies with a soft thud. "Of course, Mr. Westwood. Is something wrong, sir? Has my work somehow been unsatisfactory recently?" No, nothing like that at all," he assured her hastily, suddenly feeling profoundly awkward and self-conscious about what he was about to propose. "Actually, I have a somewhat unusual request to make of you. My annual charity gala is in 2 weeks, and I was hoping you might agree to attend as my personal guest." Emma's eyes widened in genuine surprise, and for a brief moment she seemed utterly at a loss for words, completely taken aback by his unexpected invitation. "I'm sorry, sir. Did you say as your guest, not to actually work the event?" "As a guest," Julian confirmed, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. "It's a formal affair, black tie optional, of course. Most of the city's prominent citizens will be there, along with various business associates and major philanthropists. I just thought that you might actually find it somewhat interesting." He watched carefully as a complex range of conflicting emotions flickered across her expressive face. Confusion, suspicion, and something else that might have been a subtle hint of hurt. Emma was clearly far more perceptive and intuitive than his shallow friends gave her any credit for, and he could almost visibly see her mentally trying to work out the real reason behind this highly unorthodox invitation. "Mr. Westwood, I sincerely appreciate the offer, but I'm honestly not sure that it would be entirely appropriate," she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate precision. "I am your employee, and there's a certain professional boundary that should probably be maintained in this situation." "I completely understand your hesitation," Julian replied sincerely, and he genuinely meant it. "But I would still really like you to seriously consider it anyway. You've worked diligently for me for 3 years now, and I've come to deeply respect your sharp intelligence and your unwavering character. You truly deserve an evening of fine dining and high culture as much as anyone else who will be there that night." Emma studied him intently for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for any hidden motives or ulterior agendas. "Is this some kind of elaborate social experiment, sir?" Because I should probably tell you up front that I don't particularly appreciate being made into anyone's amusing project. Her startling directness caught him completely off guard, and Julian felt a sudden rush of intense guilt washing over him. She had clearly seen right through his carefully constructed facade to the ugly truth lurking beneath, or at least close enough to make him profoundly uncomfortable. "You're absolutely right to be suspicious," he admitted, averting his gaze. "The invitation did initially start as part of a somewhat ill-advised conversation with my friends, but that doesn't necessarily make it entirely insincere. I would genuinely like you to be there, Emma. To prove something to your friends," Emma concluded flatly, crossing her arms defensively. "Let me guess. They bet you that I couldn't possibly fit in with your fancy crowd, that I'd embarrass myself and, by extension, you." Julian found that he couldn't quite bring himself to meet her piercing eyes. The brutal accuracy of her unflinching assessment stung him far more than he had ever expected. "Something like that," he confessed quietly, shamefaced. To his genuine surprise, Emma laughed softly, though there was very little actual humor in the sound. "At least you're being honest about it, I'll give you that. Most people would have simply made up some elaborate and utterly unbelievable story." She paused thoughtfully, considering her options. "If I were to actually agree to this, and I'm definitely not saying that I will, what exactly would you expect from me once I got there?" "Just be yourself," Julian said, meeting her gaze directly. "Show them that intelligence and inherent grace aren't somehow limited to people who were simply fortunate enough to be born into immense wealth and privilege." Emma shook her head slowly, a wry smile playing on her lips. "You're essentially asking me to be a representative for everyone in my particular position, to somehow prove to your snobbish friends that we're all just as inherently good as the so-called privileged elite. That's an awfully heavy burden to place on someone's shoulders just for an evening's fleeting entertainment." "You're absolutely right," Julian admitted, feeling genuinely ashamed of his own thoughtlessness. "I'm deeply sorry, Emma. This was a truly terrible idea from the very beginning. Please just completely forget that I even mentioned it." He turned to leave the room, but Emma's voice quickly stopped him in his tracks. "Wait," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't actually say no, Mr. Westwood. I simply want to fully understand exactly what I'm potentially getting myself into before I make a final decision." She took a deep breath and then continued, her gaze unwavering. "I will tentatively accept your somewhat unusual invitation, Mr. Westwood, but only on one very specific condition. Win or lose your ridiculous bet with your friends, I want you to donate double the agreed-upon amount to the literacy program at the community center where I volunteer every weekend." Julian turned back to face her, genuinely impressed by her shrewdness and her unwavering dedication to her personal principles. "That's your sole condition? Not a brand new wardrobe or a lavish bonus of some kind?" "I actually have a beautiful dress that I've been saving for just such a special occasion," Emma replied, a rare smile gracing her features. "And I certainly don't need your money, Mr. Westwood. But those bright and eager kids at the community center desperately need new books and qualified tutors. And if my mere attendance at your fancy party can somehow help them, then I'll gladly do it." Julian agreed immediately, extending his hand to seal the bargain. Emma shook it firmly, her grip confident and reassuring. As their hands briefly touched, Julian felt an unexpected jolt of something that he couldn't quite name surging through him. It wasn't simply mere physical attraction, even though he had to grudgingly admit that she was undeniably beautiful in a very natural and understated way. It was something far deeper and more significant than that, something akin to genuine recognition. It was the distinct sense that he was finally truly seeing her as a fully realized and complex person, rather than just the efficient woman who simply kept his large house running smoothly. "I should probably warn you, Mr. Westwood," Emma said as she released his hand, her eyes sparkling with an inner light. "I may currently be employed as a maid, but I absolutely refuse to pretend to be something that I'm fundamentally not. If your shallow friends expect me to be somehow intimidated or overly grateful, they're going to be sorely disappointed." Julian smiled genuinely for the first time in what felt like days. "Emma, I'm definitely counting on it." The 2 weeks leading up to the highly anticipated gala passed in a strange blur of anticipation and anxiety for both Julian and Emma. Julian found himself thinking about the upcoming event far more often than he probably should have, constantly wondering how Emma would present herself and whether his friends would actually keep their word about the substantial donation, regardless of the ultimate outcome. He even caught himself watching her more carefully as she went about her daily work, noticing previously overlooked details that had somehow escaped his attention for the past 3 years. Emma, for her part, outwardly maintained her usual professional demeanor, but Julian still sensed a subtle shift in the palpable air between them. Their increasingly frequent conversations became slightly longer and more personal, now often touching on subjects that went far beyond the mundane realm of basic household matters. She casually mentioned the book she was currently reading, a fascinating biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, and he found himself genuinely interested in her insightful thoughts about leadership and social responsibility. On the actual morning of the long-awaited gala, Julian left his luxurious penthouse relatively early for a series of important meetings, leaving Emma to quietly complete her usual household duties. What he didn't know was that she secretly had extensive plans of her own for the day. Emma had secretly called her closest and most trusted friend, Diana Chun, who worked as a highly sought-after stylist for a prestigious fashion magazine. Over the years, Emma had consistently helped Diana through various difficult times in her personal life, offering unwavering support and sound advice. And now, Diana was absolutely determined to return the valuable favor in a truly spectacular fashion. "You're going to confidently walk into that ridiculously ostentatious gala tonight and leave absolutely everyone speechless," Diana declared dramatically as she finally arrived at Emma's modest apartment carrying 2 large garment bags and a professional makeup kit that looked fit for a Hollywood movie set. Not because you're desperately trying to be someone that you're fundamentally not, but simply because they're finally going to truly see who you really are deep down inside. Emma sat somewhat nervously in her small living room, surrounded by the well-worn books and cherished photographs that told the rich and compelling story of her remarkable life. Her loving parents had courageously immigrated from Mexico when she was just 5 years old, working multiple backbreaking jobs to ensure that she could attend good schools and receive a solid education. She had ultimately earned a prestigious scholarship to a top-tier university, where she diligently studied literature and art history with a genuine passion. But her father's sudden and unexpected illness during her crucial final year had regrettably forced her to leave school prematurely and immediately find any available employment to help with the mounting medical bills. The seemingly temporary maid position at Julian's extravagant penthouse had initially been meant as a purely short-term solution. But somehow 3 long years had quietly slipped by. She had repeatedly told herself that she would eventually return to school to finally finish her long-delayed degree. But life unfortunately had a frustrating way of constantly making even the best-laid plans incredibly complicated. Her beloved father had eventually recovered from his illness, but by then her aging mother urgently needed additional financial support, and the seemingly endless cycle relentlessly continued. "I still honestly don't know exactly why I ultimately agreed to any of this," Emma said with a sigh, watching Diana carefully unzip the first garment bag. "It almost feels like I'm willingly participating in my own public humiliation." "You're doing it primarily for the critically important literacy program," Diana reminded her gently. "And maybe, just maybe, you're also doing it to quietly prove to yourself that you inherently belong absolutely anywhere you choose to be, regardless of what anyone else might think." The stunning dress that Diana dramatically revealed took Emma's breath away completely. It was a deep and vibrant emerald green that would perfectly complement her naturally olive skin tone. The elegant lines of the impeccably tailored garment were sophisticated without being overly flashy or ostentatious. The luxurious fabric shimmered subtly in the light, clearly suggesting exceptional quality without blatantly screaming for attention. "Diana, this must have cost an absolute fortune. I simply can't possibly accept this incredibly generous gift," Emma protested weakly. "It's actually a loan from the magazine's extensive fashion closet," Diana explained with a sly grin. "One of the designers owed me a rather significant favor. Now stop arguing with me and let's get you properly ready for your big night out. We have approximately 4 hours to transform you from Cinderella into the unforgettable woman who effortlessly outshines absolutely everyone at the ball." As Diana skillfully worked her magic with expertly applied makeup and a flattering new hairstyle, Emma slowly felt herself subtly transforming, both inside and out. Her long dark hair, which was usually confined to a strictly practical and unflattering bun, was now artfully styled in soft, cascading waves that tumbled gracefully over her shoulders. The makeup was subtle yet highly effective, artfully enhancing her naturally striking features, rather than completely masking them under layers of heavy cosmetics. When she finally slipped into the exquisite dress and glanced at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely even recognized the poised and confident woman staring back at her. "That's not merely a simple transformation," Diana said softly, standing proudly beside her. "That's just you, Emma, without the drab uniform and the protective walls you routinely put up each day in order to simply get through it all. That's finally Emma Rodriguez, as she was always truly meant to be seen." Meanwhile, across the sprawling city, Julian was meticulously putting on his impeccably tailored tuxedo and idly wondering what the long evening would inevitably bring. His boisterous friends had been relentlessly messaging him all day long, making increasingly crude jokes about the eagerly anticipated entertainment that undoubtedly awaited them at the gala. Benjamin had even started an informal betting pool among some of the other particularly shallow guests about precisely how long Emma would supposedly last before making some cringeworthy social mistake. Julian felt increasingly disgusted with himself for setting this whole unfortunate chain of events in motion in the first place. What had initially seemed like relatively harmless fun now felt undeniably cruel and deeply exploitative. He had even briefly considered quietly calling Emma to simply cancel everything, to sincerely tell her that she absolutely didn't need to go through with any of this. But something deep inside him stubbornly stopped him from taking that seemingly easy way out. He vividly remembered the unwavering steel in her determined eyes when she had calmly accepted his highly unorthodox invitation, and the surprisingly resourceful way she had almost instantly turned his thoughtless and insulting bet into a unique opportunity to genuinely help others. She undeniably deserved the rare chance to finally prove herself, not just for his sake or the twisted amusement of his shallow friends, but primarily for her own inherent self-worth. The annual gala was being held at the prestigious Grand Metropolitan Hotel, a luxurious ballroom that positively dripped with old-world elegance and refined charm. Ornate crystal chandeliers hung from the exquisitely decorated ceilings, and expansive floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking panoramic views of the glittering city skyline. As the meticulously dressed guests began to arrive in their designer gowns and obscenely expensive tuxedos, Julian stood somewhat stiffly near the grand entrance, greeting people with a practiced charm and a dazzling smile while his restless mind remained firmly elsewhere. Benjamin, Thomas, and Daniel quickly found him within the first half hour, already clutching oversized drinks in their well-manicured hands and sporting smug grins plastered on their thoroughly punchable faces. "So, where's your extremely special guest of honor?" Benjamin asked with barely contained amusement, his eyes twinkling with malicious glee. "Did she chicken out on you at the very last minute?" "The evening is still young," Julian replied coolly, maintaining his carefully cultivated composure. "Emma said that she would definitely be here, and I sincerely believe her." "This is going to be absolutely priceless," Thomas said, eagerly scanning the rapidly growing crowd of socialites. "I almost feel a little bad for her." "Almost." Julian was just about to formulate a suitably cutting response when the steady buzz of polite conversation near the hotel entrance suddenly and noticeably shifted. Heads began to slowly turn, and a subtle wave of excited whispers rippled audibly through the assembled crowd. He turned sharply to see what exactly had captured everyone's rapt attention, and his breath audibly caught in his throat. Emma stood regally in the doorway, poised and utterly radiant in the stunning emerald dress that genuinely seemed to have been custom-created specifically for her. Her dark hair framed her face in soft, flattering waves, and her makeup was flawless without being even remotely overdone. But it wasn't just her exceptional physical appearance that commanded immediate attention. It was the elegant way she effortlessly carried herself, with a quiet confidence and inherent natural grace that needed absolutely no apology or explanation. She calmly scanned the rapidly murmuring room, and when her searching eyes finally found Julian's across the crowded space, she smiled slightly and began to walk purposefully toward him. The assembled crowd seemed to almost instinctively part for her, silently creating a clear path through the throng of partygoers. Julian was vaguely aware of his friend's shocked and uncharacteristic silence beside him, but his complete focus remained entirely on the compelling figure of Emma as she gracefully approached. "Good evening, Mr. Westwood," she said softly when she finally reached him, her voice warm and remarkably steady. "Thank you so much for the kind invitation." Julian suddenly realized that he had been staring at her rudely, and he quickly recovered his somewhat shaken composure. "Emma, you look absolutely stunning. I'm incredibly glad that you could make it tonight." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied, her sparkling eyes twinkling with gentle amusement. She then turned to face his astonished friends, who were still visibly gaping at her truly remarkable transformation. "Good evening, gentlemen. I strongly believe that we've all previously met before, though under somewhat different circumstances, of course." Benjamin was the first to somewhat recover from his initial shock, though his usual smugness had been visibly replaced by genuine and quite bewildered surprise. "Miss Rodriguez, I hardly even recognized you. You look quite different from when we last had the pleasure of seeing you. Funny how a simple uniform can unfairly limit people's perceptions of others," Emma observed pleasantly, her smile never wavering for a moment. "But I can personally assure you that I'm still very much the same person who politely served you whiskey just 2 short weeks ago." Before anyone could even begin to formulate a coherent response, a distinguished older woman purposefully approached their small group. Margaret Thornton was one of the city's most highly respected philanthropists, known for her razor-sharp wit and her uncanny ability to spot any hint of pretense from fully across a crowded room. "Julian dear, aren't you even going to bother to introduce me to your obviously lovely companion? I honestly don't believe that I've had the distinct pleasure of seeing her at any of these types of events before." "Mrs. Thornton, this is Emma Rodriguez," Julian said, feeling genuinely grateful for the timely interruption. "Emma, Margaret Thornton is the esteemed founder of the Children's Arts Foundation." Emma's face lit up with genuine and unfeigned interest. "Mrs. Thornton, what an absolute honor to finally meet you in person. I've read extensively about your exceptional work in providing vital music and art education to underprivileged children throughout the city. The incredibly insightful article in last month's Arts Review was particularly inspiring." Margaret's eyebrows rose with genuine and pleasant surprise. "You actually read Arts Review? How utterly refreshing. Most of the people at these elaborate events can barely even tell me what's prominently displayed in the newspaper headlines. Tell me honestly, what exactly did you personally think of the recent piece about innovative community-based arts programs?" For the next 10 minutes, Julian watched in absolute amazement as Emma eloquently engaged in a thoughtful and highly informed discussion about arts education, community-driven urban development, and the profound importance of providing creative expression opportunities for all young people. She spoke with both extensive knowledge and clear passion, expertly referencing specific local programs and relevant statistical data, while also sharing insightful observations culled from her dedicated volunteer work at the local community center. Margaret was clearly delighted by their engaging conversation, and before she reluctantly moved on to greet some of the other eager guests, she warmly touched Emma's arm. "My dear, you simply must come and visit the foundation sometime in the very near future. We desperately need more genuinely committed people with your unique insight and undeniable passion. Julian, you've obviously been hiding this absolute treasure from all of us for far too long. Shame on you, young man." As Margaret finally walked away, Benjamin looked as though he had been suddenly struck by a bolt of lightning. How on earth did she know all of that incredibly specific information? He muttered incredulously to Thomas. "I honestly thought she was just a maid." "She actually is just a maid," Daniel replied quietly, though his earlier tone of cruel mockery had now been conspicuously replaced by a thoughtful hint of genuine respect. "But apparently, she's also a fully realized human being with her own unique interests and impressive intelligence. Who possibly could have known?" Emma subtly heard his somewhat snide comment and turned to directly face them all. "Actually, gentlemen, I personally prefer to think of myself primarily as a person, first and foremost, with a job that simply happens to involve cleaning. Just as you are all undoubtedly people first who simply happen to work in the demanding fields of business and high finance. The primary difference, of course, is that society unfortunately values your labor far differently than it currently values mine. but that in no way inherently makes my important work any less vital, or me any less worthy of common human respect. The unexpected directness of her undeniably valid statement created a somewhat uncomfortable silence among the small group. Julian felt a sudden surge of both intense admiration and genuine guilt washing over him. She was absolutely right, of course, and she had just eloquently articulated something that he had somehow never quite managed to put into words himself. Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "I suppose we all owe you a sincere apology, Miss Rodriguez. We may have been somewhat dismissive when we first met you." "Somewhat," Emma repeated with a slight but knowing smile. "That's definitely a rather diplomatic way of putting it, but I sincerely appreciate the somewhat belated acknowledgement. Now, if you'll all excuse me, I distinctly see the delicious appetizers finally being served, and I'm actually quite hungry." She confidently walked away with her head held high and her shoulders squared, leaving the four chastened men staring silently after her in stunned disbelief. Benjamin slowly shook his head. "I think we may have made a terrible mistake. Don't you think?" Julian snapped. "This whole thing was a terrible mistake from the get-go. Betting on whether another human being could measure up to our ridiculous standards of worthiness." Throughout the evening, Julian kept a close, yet discreet, eye on Emma as she navigated the crowd. To his continued astonishment, she seemed completely at ease. She joined conversations naturally, contributed thoughtful insights, and even had people laughing with her sharp wit. Several guests specifically sought her out after hearing her speak, eager to hear more about her perspectives on various topics. At one point, Julian found himself standing next to her by the windows overlooking the sprawling city lights. "You're full of surprises," he said quietly, almost to himself. Emma turned to him, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Am I? Or did you just never bother to ask who I was beyond the person who cleaned your home?" The question landed with more force than any outright accusation could have. "You're right," Julian admitted, a hint of shame creeping into his voice. "I've been incredibly blind and thoughtless. For 3 years you've been working in my home, and I never once considered that you might have a whole life, dreams, interests, passions that had nothing to do with your job." "Most people don't," Emma said, her voice softening, losing its sharp edge. "We live in a world where we define each other by what we do for work rather than who we are as people. You're not unique in that regard, though perhaps you should hold yourself to a higher standard." Before Julian could respond, the master of ceremonies announced that dinner would be served shortly and requested that everyone find their assigned seats. Julian had deliberately seated Emma at his table along with Margaret Thornton and several other thoughtful, accomplished individuals he deeply respected. During dinner, Emma continued to captivate everyone with her insightful conversation. She discussed classic literature with a retired professor, debated urban planning strategies with a city council member, and shared touching, heartfelt stories about the children she tutored at the community center. Julian found himself seeing his entire social circle through new eyes, noticing which of his acquaintances were genuinely interested in Emma as a person and which ones were simply putting on a polite facade. His 3 friends, seated at a nearby table, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. It was becoming painfully obvious that Emma was not only holding her own but exceeding expectations in every conceivable way. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove a point. She was simply being herself, and that authenticity was far more compelling than any carefully crafted performance could ever have been. As dessert was being served, Benjamin approached Julian, his expression noticeably chastened. "I need to talk to you about the bet," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. "What about it?" Julian asked, although he already knew what was coming. "It's off," Benjamin declared, finally meeting Julian's gaze. "We were wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. Your friend, your employee, whatever you want to call her, she's extraordinary. And we were jerks for thinking otherwise." Julian looked at his old friend and saw genuine remorse etched on his face. "Thank you for saying that, but you should be telling Emma, not me." "I will," Benjamin promised. "But first, I want you to know that we're going to honor the donation anyway. Double what we bet. It's going to that literacy program she mentioned. It's the least we can do." As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, Julian found Emma standing alone on the terrace, gazing out at the glittering city lights. He joined her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Quite an evening," she said without turning to look at him. "You were magnificent," Julian replied honestly. "Thank you for doing this." "I didn't do it for you," Emma reminded him gently, her voice barely a whisper. "I did it for the kids at the center who need books and hope. But I'll admit there was a small part of me that wanted to prove something. Not to your friends, but to myself." "And did you?" Julian asked, stepping a little closer. Emma finally turned to face him, and in the soft light spilling from the ballroom, he saw a complex mixture of emotions reflected in her eyes. "Yes and no. I proved that I can hold my own in any environment, that my worth isn't determined by my job title or bank account. But I also realized something else tonight." "What's that?" "That I've been hiding," Emma said quietly, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've been using the maid position as a shield, telling myself it's temporary while letting years slip by. Tonight reminded me that I have more to offer the world, and I owe it to myself, and to my parents' sacrifices, to pursue that potential." Julian felt a sinking sensation in his chest, a mixture of regret and apprehension. "Are you saying you're going to quit?" "Yes," Emma replied firmly, meeting his gaze once more. "I'll give you 2 weeks to find a replacement, but then I'm going back to university to finish my degree. I'm going to become the person I was meant to be before life got complicated." "I'll miss having you around," Julian said, and he meant it more than she could possibly know. Emma smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Will you miss me? Or will you miss having someone who keeps your life organized and your books properly shelved?" "Both," Julian admitted, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "But mostly the former. Tonight showed me what a fool I've been. You've been right there in my home for 3 years, and I never truly saw you." "Not really. And now you do?" Emma asked, her tone gentle but laced with skepticism. "Now I do," Julian confirmed, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'm realizing what I'm about to lose." The morning after the gala, Julian woke with an unfamiliar feeling weighing heavily in his chest. It took him several minutes to identify it as a potent cocktail of regret and a newfound sense of determination. The penthouse felt different somehow, as though Emma's absence was already palpable, despite her not having officially left yet. He made coffee in his pristine kitchen, a space that Emma had meticulously maintained with such care, and realized how little he actually knew about the basic mechanics of his own home. Emma arrived at her usual time, carrying herself with the same quiet professionalism she always had. But something had shifted. Julian noticed it immediately. She moved through her duties with her typical efficiency, but there was a newfound lightness to her step, a sense that a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Good morning," Julian said, intercepting her in the hallway, his voice a little more hesitant than usual. "Do you have a moment to talk?" "Of course, Mr. Westwood," she replied, setting down her cleaning supplies. "Please call me Julian," he said. "I think we're past formalities at this point." Emma studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his, before nodding slowly. "All right, Julian. What did you want to discuss?" "Everything," he blurted out, then immediately laughed at himself, embarrassed by his own impulsiveness. "I'm sorry that came out wrong. I wanted to talk about last night, about your decision to leave, and about what happens next." They settled in his study, the very same room where the ill-fated bet had been made just 2 weeks earlier. Julian poured them both coffee and sat across from Emma, seeing her fully, perhaps for the first time since she had started working for him. "First, I want to apologize again for the bet and for treating you as less than a complete person for so long," Julian began, his voice sincere. "There's no excuse for it." "Apology accepted," Emma said simply, her expression neutral. "But Julian, you need to understand something. You weren't uniquely terrible. You were just typically thoughtless. Most people treat service workers as invisible or interchangeable. You, at least, were never rude or demeaning. You were just absent, which, in some ways, is worse because it's so casual." Her words stung precisely because they were true. "I want to do better," he said, his voice filled with conviction. Not just with future employees, but in general. Last night, watching you shine in that room full of supposedly important people, I realized that I've been living a very small life despite all my wealth and privilege. Emma tilted her head, genuinely curious now. What do you mean? I mean that I go through the motions of being successful without ever asking what success actually means. Julian explained, the thoughts crystallizing as he spoke. I attend galas and business dinners. I make profitable investments. I surround myself with people who confirm my worldview. But what am I actually contributing? What difference am I making? That's a question only you can answer, Emma said softly, her voice laced with empathy. But I will say this, you have resources that most people will never have. The question is whether you'll use them to insulate yourself from the world or to engage with it meaningfully. They talked for over an hour, the longest genuine conversation they had ever had. Emma told him about her family, her interrupted education, her dreams of working in arts education or museum curation. She spoke about the kids she tutored, the joy she found in watching them discover the power of reading, and the frustration she felt at how woefully underfunded their programs were. Julian, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he rarely did. He talked about the pressure of family expectations, the loneliness of wealth, and the way success had become hollow when it wasn't connected to any greater purpose. He admitted that he had been coasting for years, making money because that was what he knew how to do, but feeling increasingly empty despite all his achievements. So, what are you going to do about it? Emma asked directly, her gaze unwavering. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken expectations. I don't know yet, Julian admitted, his voice laced with uncertainty. But I know I want to be different. To do better? Emma pressed gently. Maybe you could help me figure out how. Emma shook her head gently, a faint smile playing on her lips. That's not my job, Julian. It was never my job to fix you or save you from your own emptiness. You need to figure out who you want to be and then become that person through your own efforts. You're right, he acknowledged, his voice tinged with resignation. But could I at least ask for your advice sometimes? As a friend? A friend? Emma repeated, testing the word, considering its implications. Is that what we are now? I'd like us to be, Julian said honestly, his gaze unwavering. If you're willing. Emma smiled, a real smile that transformed her face, erasing the lines of weariness and replacing them with a radiant warmth. I think I'd like that too. But let's be clear about boundaries. I work for you for 2 more weeks, and during that time our relationship remains strictly professional. After that, if a friendship develops naturally, then good. But I won't be your project or your redemption story. Fair enough, Julian agreed, extending his hand. Emma shook it, and this time the gesture felt like the beginning of something genuine, rather than a mere transaction. True to her word, Emma maintained professional boundaries for her remaining 2 weeks. She meticulously trained her replacement, a pleasant woman named Rita, who Julian suspected would never organize his books quite the same way. Meanwhile, Julian found himself making changes in his life that surprised even him. He started volunteering at the community center where Emma tutored, initially just observing, but gradually taking on a small reading group of his own. The kids were suspicious of him at first, this wealthy stranger invading their space. But his genuine interest in their lives and Emma's vouching for him eventually won them over. He also had a long, difficult conversation with Benjamin, Thomas, and Daniel about their attitudes and behaviors. To their credit, his friends listened and acknowledged their faults. Benjamin followed through on his promise to donate generously to the literacy program, and Thomas even joined Julian on a few volunteer sessions. On Emma's last day of work, Julian had arranged a small farewell gathering. Rita was there, along with the building's doorman and security staff, all of whom had come to respect Emma over the years. Julian gave a short speech thanking Emma for her service and, more importantly, for opening his eyes to perspectives he had been blind to. He presented her with a sealed envelope. "It's not a bonus or a gift," he explained quickly, seeing her hesitation. "It's information about scholarship programs and grants for returning students. I had my assistant research the options. What you do with it is entirely up to you. Emma opened the envelope and scanned the documents, her eyes widening in surprise and gratitude. This is incredibly thorough. Thank you, Julian. This means more than you know. After the others had left, Emma and Julian stood alone in the penthouse one last time, a palpable sense of closure hanging in the air. So, this is it? She said, looking around the space she had diligently maintained for 3 years. End of one chapter, Julian replied, a hint of anticipation in his voice. Beginning of another. I'm nervous, Emma admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Going back to school, starting over in some ways. What if I've forgotten how to be a student? What if I don't belong there anymore? You'll belong wherever you choose to be, Julian said with absolute conviction. Last night at the gala proved that you weren't successful because you pretended to be someone else. You were successful because you were authentically yourself, and that's enough. Emma blinked back tears, surprised by the surge of emotion welling up inside her. Thank you for that. And Julian, for what it's worth, I think you're going to be okay, too. The man I saw at the community center reading to those kids, that's the real you. That's who you are when you stop trying to live up to everyone else's expectations. They hugged briefly, a gesture that felt both natural and significant, a culmination of their shared journey. When Emma walked out of the penthouse for the last time, she didn't look back. Julian stood at the window, watching her emerge onto the street below and hail a taxi. He felt the loss keenly, but also a strange sense of hope, a belief that something profound had shifted in both of them during these few weeks, a transformation that went far deeper than surface appearances. 6 months passed. Emma returned to university and threw herself into her studies with renewed passion and determination. She worked part-time at an art gallery, gaining invaluable experience in the field she loved. The scholarship information Julian had provided led her to a grant specifically for returning students from underrepresented backgrounds, and she received enough funding to focus primarily on her education. Julian, meanwhile, continued his volunteer work and began redirecting a significant portion of his investment portfolio towards socially responsible ventures. He started a foundation focused on education and arts access, consulting frequently with Margaret Thornton and other experienced philanthropists to ensure its effectiveness. His friends noticed the change in him. He seemed more engaged with life, more purposeful, more driven by something other than wealth accumulation. Emma and Julian stayed in touch, meeting for coffee every few weeks to catch up on their lives. Their conversations ranged from serious discussions about pressing social issues to lighthearted debates about books and movies. Slowly, carefully, a genuine friendship blossomed, one based on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep appreciation for each other's unique perspectives, rather than hierarchy or obligation. One evening, Julian attended an exhibition at the gallery where Emma worked. She had helped curate the show, which featured emerging artists from underrepresented communities, providing them with a platform to showcase their talent. As he walked through the space, listening to Emma passionately explain each artist's vision and technique, Julian realized something that had been quietly building for months, a truth that he could no longer deny. He had fallen in love with her, not with the idea of her, or with the story of the maid who became his equal, but with Emma herself. He loved her intelligence, her compassion, her unwavering strength, and her unshakable authenticity. But he also knew that this realization came with a significant responsibility. He couldn't approach her with these feelings until he was absolutely certain that he saw her clearly, not through the distorted lens of transformation or redemption, but simply as Emma, the extraordinary woman she had always been. After the exhibition, they walked through the city streets, talking about art and education and dreams. Emma spoke excitedly about her plans to develop innovative community-based museum programs that would make art accessible to neighborhoods that rarely had the opportunity to experience it. Julian shared his vision for the foundation and eagerly sought her input, valuing her perspective as he had come to value few others. Emma, he said, stopping on a bridge overlooking the glittering river, the city lights twinkling like a million scattered diamonds. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that our friendship means too much to me to risk it lightly. She turned to him, her expression a mixture of curiosity and slight concern. What is it? I've fallen in love with you, Julian said simply, his voice filled with honesty. Not with the woman who came to the gala and proved everyone wrong, though that moment was remarkable in its own right. I love who you are every day. The way you think about the world, the passion you bring to everything you do, the way you challenge me to be better. But I also know that we have a complicated history, and I would never want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way. Emma was quiet for a long, drawn-out moment, her gaze fixed on the water below, and Julian's heart sank, certain that he had miscalculated everything and ruined the precious friendship they had carefully cultivated. But then she smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up her entire face, chasing away the shadows of doubt and apprehension. You know what's funny? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been in love with you too, but I was afraid to say anything. Afraid it would seem like the cliché ending to a fairy tale, the maid falling for the prince. But we're not a fairy tale, are we? Julian countered, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. We're just two people who saw each other clearly and chose to grow together. Not a fairy tale, Emma agreed, her smile widening as she reached for his hand. Something better, something real. They kissed on that bridge, as the city lights danced on the water below, illuminating their faces with a soft, ethereal glow. Two people who had started in vastly different places, but had found common ground through honesty, personal growth, and mutual respect. A year later, Julian and Emma stood together at the grand opening of the Rodriguez Westwood Center for Community Arts, a state-of-the-art facility that offered free programs in visual arts, music, theater, and dance to young people from underserved neighborhoods, providing them with opportunities they might never otherwise have. Emma had taken a leadership role in developing the center's curriculum, drawing on her studies and her years of experience understanding what marginalized communities truly needed to thrive. The center was funded primarily by Julian's foundation, but Emma had insisted on equal partnership in all major decisions. Her name came first in the title, not because he insisted on it, but because she had undeniably earned it through her unwavering vision and tireless dedication. As they cut the ribbon together, surrounded by beaming families from the neighborhood, Julian reflected on how far they had both come since that fateful evening. The journey from employer and employee to equal partners in every sense of the word had been neither simple nor straightforward. It had required both of them to relentlessly examine their deeply ingrained assumptions, confront their hidden biases, and consistently choose personal growth over the comfortable familiarity of the status quo. Emma looked at him and squeezed his hand, understanding without words everything he was thinking, the shared struggles, the hard-won victories, the unwavering commitment to building a better future. They had become partners in the truest sense, building something truly meaningful together while simultaneously maintaining their individual identities and aspirations. That evening, as they sat on the roof of their modest but comfortable apartment building, watching the sunset paint the sky in a breathtaking array of brilliant colors, Emma leaned against Julian's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. You know what I think about sometimes? She mused, her voice soft and dreamy. That night at the gala, how terrified and angry I was, how fiercely determined to prove something. Do you regret it? Julian asked, gently stroking her hair. No, Emma said firmly, shaking her head. It was the push I needed to stop hiding, to finally embrace my potential. But I'm glad we didn't rush into anything. We needed time to become who we really were, not who we appeared to be in that moment. 2 transformations, Julian said, raising an imaginary glass in a silent toast. 2 authentic connections, Emma countered with a radiant smile, her eyes sparkling with affection. They sat in comfortable silence as night slowly fell over the city, the distant hum of traffic a soothing lullaby. 2 people who had learned that real transformation wasn't about changing who you are to fit someone else's limited expectations, but about becoming more fully and unapologetically yourself, and finding someone who saw and valued that authentic self, someone who cherished you for exactly who you were. The Millionaire and the Maid had both been woefully incomplete descriptions from the very start, reductive labels that failed to capture the complexity and depth of their individual identities. They were simply Julian and Emma, 2 imperfect humans navigating the messy complexities of life, love, and purpose together, supporting each other's dreams, and building a more just and equitable world. One small act of kindness and compassion at a time. And that story, unglamorous and profoundly honest, was far more beautiful and inspiring than any contrived fairy tale could ever hope to be.